Now by microwave, Prime Minister Pearson in Ottawa speaks with Charles Templeton in Toronto.
We are here as men of peace, but we are here also to declare our full and forthright support of what is in great measure a military alliance.
And to feel like, as much as is possible in this kind of world, the master in his own house.
Under the great hammer blows of homogenizing from the United States.
But all it took to enter the United States was a New York marketing expert and a campaign to make Moosehead an exotic specialty.
I happen to believe that you've sold us out.
But in the background is a much wider and more suggestive question connected with the fact that Canada seems to have moved from a pre-national to a post-national phase of existence without ever having been a nation.
But listen, you kid, don't get caught in the Canadian syndrome, where if it's Canadian, it's got to be bad. We're the best. I've been telling you the best.
Hello and welcome to the podcast of the Red Enisgn. I'm glad to have back with me my typical co-host, crῠptός. After a brief hiatus from hosting others, I've got my technical situation fixed. So we can go back to the regular broadcast schedule for this program. I hope you've all enjoyed the 6 episodes of the Red Enisgn special. How are you doing, crῠptós?
I'm doing fabulous. Yeah, it's been kind of weird watching you drop episodes and like, hey, wait a minute, but it's I've enjoyed them and they've been informative, but it is good to be talking again.
Yeah, it's good. I think we last spoke about 6 weeks ago, and the way that the discourse has moved, it seems like a year ago. A lot has happened.
It is crazy.
Do you want to tell me what you put out in the tell the audience what you put out in the last 6 weeks?
Well, I put out a number of art. Well, one of them, I mean, because of the last 6 weeks, that is like a long time. But I have been writing about. I posted a piece in the American Reformer on counteracting the idea of somebody there wrote about that Christians need to make common cause with the materialists against the mystics. So I made a reformed case for Protestant mysticism, and that's probably as far back as we go. And then I did a nice little a recording with someone that we know, another Canadian, Ben Fleming, and we talked about why Constitution sucks. I did a post on why you should read Karl Marx, and and then there was that brutal murder of what's her name?
Charlie.
The Renya.
The random
subway girl.
Ukrainian on the subway, yeah.
Yeah, and then Charlie Kirk. And then I wrote a piece just because I tend to have the habit of sort of trying to stand apart somewhat from the discourse, or sort of try to imbibe the habits that Jacques Ellul teaches us about propaganda. And so I wrote a couple things that people don't want to hear about that. And then I did an ill-advised, I thought people might enjoy a 3-part sermon series that I did recently on Colossians, and decided to post the 3 texts of the sermon plus the 3 audio recordings, and then a recording of the book of Colossians all at once on one day. And that cost me about 50 subscribers. I've actually gained back about 35 of them, but it was like, in hindsight, I thought, yeah, this is great. They get them all at once. And I think people getting 7 emails in a 6-hour span in their boxes was probably a little too much for a few. And so that was bad. I did a recording with Johann Kurtz on being a man. And I did another one on with Mark Granza on talking about being a man in the age of social media. And then finally another one where Athenian Stranger and I spend almost 2 hours walking through how people badly misunderstand and misapply Carl Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction, which I think is good. But the last 3 are all under like 2-week paid subscriber sort of what do you call it? Where they get a
delayed release.
Yeah, so that's been my solution now to dealing with that. It's nice because it opens up the archives to everybody, but then gives the subscribers they're getting a sense of value. They get it a couple weeks ahead of the curve, which is nice. So.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. Very scattershot, very unfocused, and yet quite intellectual.
Oh yeah, I'm
It's
just doing my own thing here.
The one of the comments that I made on Twitter over the past week is the relative intellectual decline of the online right has been it's something that I lament, but I think it's something that most people actually don't care very much about. Most people
haven't noticed.
Most people who are interested in the online right are interested in the politics. They're not interested in the intellectual element of it. Whereas I got interested
us versus them.
Yeah, whereas I got interested in the online right for for the purposes of looking at serious academic work that addresses politics rather than doing politics. This is one of the things you get out of being a Canadian, like whether Team Red or Team Blue wins in U.S. politics. I mean, it matters, but you have a little bit of arm's length from it. And so
you do. It does help with the propaganda and distancing yourself from it somewhat, but it is very easy to get caught up in the whole discourse. And you know, if you're going to do and really think about the moment and speak to it, and you know, I kind of take almost like a pastor's approach to it, where you're in some sense trying to speak to our guys about what's going on with messages that they may not want to hear. So you're sometimes analyzing your own guys without trying to put them off entirely, but to say, hey, you guys need to maybe like look in the mirror a little bit and see where you are and where you're at. And, you know, sometimes that just means going back and re-examining some of these, you know, you thought, well, you know, didn't we do Schmidt during COVID? But then you realize that, like, yeah, no, since Trump got elected, everybody's forgotten all of the lessons of everything that they've learned in the last 4 years, if they learned them at all. And that's maybe some of the things. It's been the last 6 months have been very revealing about where the state of discourse is.
Yeah, I also forget how many people just weren't there in like 2014. So like I remember the online right as it existed in like 2014 and 2013. I was a consumer of its content for a very, very long time before I began contributing to it. And I was a consumer of its content for a whole variety of reasons, but I never contributed to it at that time. Well, for a number of reasons, but one of them, it had a very kind of coarse edge at the time that I have an artistic appreciation for, but I've always kind of wanted to have a distance from.
Yeah, I was still breaking away from. The process began in around 2008, but it was a slow process for somebody when you're on your own and you're the only person who thinks and talks about this stuff. And I didn't think about the idea that, oh, you could have a fake ID on like an anonymous online identity and then do all the posting. I just didn't post because I have a business and I didn't want to like torpedo my business with putting you know, something that could be misunderstood in the comment section somewhere. But, you know, I was reading American Conservative and the American Spectator, and that was about it. And I had rejected National Review already by 20.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, so there we go. Go. We all have our journey, right? I mean,
but the reason I ask you to recount all the stuff you've done besides to promote it is to remind everyone of the great escalation that has occurred in red versus blue factional politics over the last 6-8 weeks.
Oh, yeah.
I haven't really spoken much on this channel about the assassination of Charlie Kirk, about the political response to it, about some of the broader currents in the Trump administration. But it's been a huge shift in the focus of American politics. And it's, you know, as Canadians, it's worth kind of understanding that. I mean, you and I did what I consider to be a very good podcast about how sovereigns are called to de-escalate factional political violence inside their nation.
And it's a hard thing to do, and it requires making tough decisions.
Well, I actually don't. I mean, it's an emotionally difficult thing to do, but I actually don't think it's if you were to put yourself in the position as sovereign over the United States, the solution in the moment is
it would be easier than you might think.
It's quite simple. It's you roll up the Antifa network, you arrest them all, you scare the crap out of them, and you execute the ringleaders. And then you go back to business as usual. That's not hard, except that there's real factional political power on Team Blue, and quite frankly, the Trump administration is too chicken shit to do anything like that.
Well, and Team Red really lacks the institutional backing to do the kind of things that Team Blue does in terms of street violence and then protecting it. It's there's still a weakness there that most people are not quite. They just aren't willing to admit. I think
it's not a symmetric conflict at all, which means that escalation of political violence is a sign that the conflict is trending in favor of Team Blue rather than trending in favor of Team Red. So that's, but as I say, like if the Trump administration could find its manhood, it could de-escalate the situation quite easily, quite quickly. It refuses to. And nobody should turn away from the fact that it just refuses to do what a sovereign is obligated to do when political violence breaks out on the street.
And the more troubling thing is nobody really wants to ask why. And those are the more difficult questions. Like I've spent most of my time trying to avoid getting sucked into what's happening and the response to it online, and then having like a constant stream of people in my DMs and so forth, kind of wondering, like, has everybody lost their mind? And it's been kind of a weird 6 weeks that way.
Yeah, it's an interesting moment, but it's also an interesting moment in Canadian political history. And I want to check back. The last podcast we did was called The Condition of Canada Question. And in it, we talked about the progress of the Carney government in their, what we've called on this podcast, the pivot, their attempt to reposition Canada in a number of ways. And I want to check in on the Canadian news to look at what has and hasn't happened in this regard. A lot of the Red Ensign special videos that I've done address some of these topics in more depth. And so I would encourage people to go back and have a look. But really, there's 4 key news stories that have come through over the past 6 weeks that I want to make sure our viewers don't miss. So first is Canada's population numbers have come in from StatsCan for the second quarter in a row. They show essentially flat population growth, and they show a substantial reduction in the number of non-permanent residents. So TFWs, student visa holders, are going home in droves, and the rate of immigration to the country at this moment is more or less balanced with the population decline of the native population, right? Yes. This is not the immigration policy that you and I would favor, but this is a radical departure with the last 10 years of immigration policy to Canada.
Yeah, and from a Laurentian perspective, from a leadership group that's actually in charge and wants to stay in charge via, the popular vote, this might be as far as they can go.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see how it goes forward, but I want to draw attention to this because there have been a lot of people who have expressed the sentiment that the Carney government is a continuation of the Trudeau government in a number of ways. This is just not the case, right? The Trudeau government was bringing hundreds of thousands of people over and above the population growth rate, the population decline rate every quarter to Canada, and expanding the footprint of the TFW and student visa programs. That's not happening under the Carney government. It's not what I want, but it is completely different. So we just
and it's the idea is that because economic investment in Canada has shifted so much towards real estate, away from funding small businesses, that the Canadian economy is over dependent upon maintaining real estate prices. So
they're trying to
have geared except for everywhere, like the major centers where the most immigrants are located, Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, these places have been the hardest hit. So, but outside of those major centers, real estate prices are largely flat, and that's the goal. And so they will, now that they've stabilized the population, they can now fiddle with interest rates in order to kind of keep everything kind of going at that flat level. And as long as everything stays flat, as long as the bottom doesn't drop out of the real estate market, then you can keep housing going. You can keep the equity in
fundamentally
homes and those kind of things.
Fundamentally, from their perspective, it means that the social order that has existed in Canada will continue, right? And that's the interest the Laurentian elite really have. They could care if real estate goes up or down 5 or 10% really doesn't matter to them. What matters to them is if changes in either the real estate market or the ethnic makeup of the country or the state of law and order in the country become disruptive to the social order and therefore their control.
That's right. Yeah, and that's really because, the current order is good for the Laurentian elites, and so they will do everything in their power to maintain the current order, again, because it's good for them.
Now, there's one way in which they have elected to purposefully disrupt the social order, and that is they have begun the long overdue confrontation with the degree mill industry in this country. So this story is one of many stories I could have selected. But there's mass layoffs going on throughout higher education in Canada because there's this huge mushroom of jobs in higher ed over the last 10 years, entirely predicated on a tuition for visas kind of scam at the low end college and universities, particularly in the province of Ontario, but all over Canada. And the Carney government has, they haven't quite nuked this, but they've put a real dent in the side of this particularly disgusting industry.
Yeah. And it's also the thing that has precipitated the strike by, what is it, OPSEU? The union that supports the support workers, like the administrative staff and so forth. So they're all now out on strike, and they want guaranteed jobs. So they can man so they can man empty cafeterias for universities that nobody goes to,
which is amazing. But
that's not going to, I don't know, maybe they just don't quite maybe there's a reason why they're not professors. I'm sorry, that's unkind.
Ouch. If you're a lowly TA listening to this stream, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, folks. The little people really do matter. But just driving by, just hearing the rhetoric from the strikes is just, it makes me want to bang my head against the wall. So, not sympathy inducing. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, it's like when the posties go on strike and complain that they, only have indexed pensions for retirement.
Yeah, my next door neighbor 2 doors down is a postal worker, and he thinks his fellow coworkers are a bunch of idiots.
Oh my goodness. All right, so those are two very significant stories in the broad pivot. We have number 3. So the Carney government has announced its intention to drop a budget this fall. The budget they're calling it a generational investment in Canada. That generational investment apparently includes no new pipelines.
Yeah, and so this gets at the heart of one of the fundamental conflicts, both with Carney personally as the architect of the net zero
banking
the
alliance
framework, but also with his propagandized base, because this was one of those issues that doesn't necessarily affect them directly in terms of jobs and so forth, and like the immigration policy is the kind of thing that affects people in their day-to-day lives in a way that's different, whereas the idealism of saving the environment is much more ingrained propagandistically in the broader voting base of the left, because there were stories of liberal support groups that were out protesting the Carney government for wanting to remove the environmental constraints that would allow them to develop greater natural resources. So this was one of these areas where they had to pull back because they didn't have the propaganda ground to push forward with this, and so they buckled.
They have no narrative, and so it's very hard for them to struggle with their own base, because
that's right.
The narrative is that Canada needs to make money, and that's just not very compelling to the liberal base.
Well, no, and then especially because now Poilievre has begun to clue in that the policies that would make up the pivot, the things that would go into the pivot, are very popular, especially among his electorate, that they began to glom onto these. And then it further exacerbates it, because now that Poilievre it's no longer just Carney pivoting, Poilievre is politicizing it, and thus it becomes the us versus them. The base gets really amped up, because now you're basically bringing conservative politics, those conservative, like all the policies of those Nazis, and you're going to impose them on, and so it just really amps everything up. And so he was forced to back off.
Yeah. I mean, if you wanted to see pipelines built in Canada, the worst thing that happened was Poilievre adopted it as a policy platform, right?
Yeah, exactly, because now it politicized it. And that's, so and that in many ways, if anything's going to kill the pivot, it's Poilievre embracing it.
Yeah. I mean, Poilievre is just an incredibly incompetent figure at this point, which is
brutal. Why they haven't gotten rid of him is just beyond me.
That's a whole discussion in itself, but, there he is. And then in advance of this budget dropping, the Parliamentary Budget Office decided that he would salt the ground in advance of the coming budget by pointing out that the Carney government can't run $80 billion deficits forever. I think the PBO's estimate is that the budget this year is going to be something like the deficit is going to be something like $65 billion. Interestingly, if you watch my video, Is Canada Broke? My estimate based on the quarterly data out of StatsCan is that it's going to be quite a bit worse than this, something more like $100 billion in deficit this year. And I think the reason the PBO is a bit more optimistic is that the PBO isn't dealing properly with the reduction in tax revenue that's going to come with the continued shrinking of the Canadian economy. The PBO does something that every economist agrees is stupid, but their alternatives are difficult. They do static analysis, so they assume that things like government revenues will stay the same in the future, government revenues never stay the same in the future, but
every action that you act on in terms of taxes and budget and spending all impact the amount of revenue that you take in. It's a dynamic system that way.
But the problem is, if you're the PBO, any dynamic analysis you do is going to be inherently political. And so they've, for many, many years, chosen to act like they're stupid and do static analysis. So they've come out to warn the Carney government that running a $60 billion deficit might not be a good idea, and that it's not going to be able to go on forever. But the Carney government probably knows what I pointed out in that video, which is that there's a runway of several years in which you can run very large deficits in Canada before you run up against hard fiscal reality. And I assume they're hoping that a couple of things will happen in that runway. First of all, they're hoping that the politics in Washington will change and the tariff economy will end. Whether that hope is reasonable or not, who knows? But I'm sure the Carney government, in their heart of hearts, just kind of hopes that that problem all goes away. And they're also hoping that their, quote, generational investments start to bear some fruit. We're going to see what the Carney government thinks generational investments are, but I'm not betting on it. So,
well, yeah, and alongside of this, then you also have the 0.25 point drop in interest rates, which signals that the quantitative easing is coming back. So, I mean, we've been in a recession for what now, 18 months or so already, I think we're negative growth. So the technical, we're not technically in a recession in Canada. We had a recession which ended, and we are in the first quarter of negative GDP growth. When the numbers come out for the second consecutive quarter, which will probably also be negative, then we will officially be in a recession. So we will be in a second recession inside of 3 years, post-COVID. Yeah, and
the Bank of Canada has already started responding by lowering interest rates. So they've lowered interest rates, I think, 5 times now since their peak. And based on based on the writing on the wall, we're probably going back to the zero bound here sometime.
Yeah, the quest for zero. It's one of these things where, like, they're caught between a rock and a hard place, because inflation is taking off, and in order to battle inflation, your interest rate should be 1 to 2% above the rate of for a sound money policy. So they really probably should be running double digit, federal bank. The lending rate should be probably in like 8 to 10% right now, something like that. But to do that, it would just bring us into a recession and just clear all the money out, the excess money out of the economy. But they can't do that because it would be electoral suicide. And so they've chosen to devalue the currency and hope nobody notices that they're, 30% poorer in 2 years, and they can declare that now we've got a roaring good economy, which is it's ludicrous.
Well, I mean, it's complicated. So you point out that the Volcker rule, which was the rule for interest rates that people in the American Empire lived with from the late 70s through till the early 90s, is that interest rates should be something like 3% above inflation. If interest rates were 3% above inflation in Canada right now, they'd be about 8%.
If you could believe the official numbers.
Well, so the official numbers are so you can run the numbers a number of different ways. One of the problems in Canada is that inflation is running the hottest on goods that are produced abroad, but not in the third world. So things like fruits and vegetables, which sort of grow in Canada, but not really, and not all the time. We have this tremendous problem with meat, and that problem is exasperated by let's call it problems in the Canadian agricultural market, but also we're busy bulldozing all of our farmland in order to build subdivisions
for instruments.
Yeah, so that can't be great either. So it is. And as you say, if you raise interest rates to the levels that they would be at according to previous standards for economic management, you'd cause a real estate crisis, but you would also cause a government finance crisis, because the reason why we can run $80 billion deficits is that interest rates are at the zero bound. Because if interest rates were not at the zero bound, then the interest on the debt would quickly overwhelm the government budget.
And it's amazing that the entity that sets the rates is also tied into the government. You just go figure, hey?
Yeah. So at present, the Canadian dollar is hanging in, so they can continue to operate this way. And my guess is they can continue to operate this way for a period of time, because the Canadian dollar doesn't show signs of breaking down quite yet. But
well,
that's
largely because all the other central banks are following the same policy, both in the U.S. and in Europe.
It's more complicated than that, though. Anyways, the Canadian government got itself into a much better fiscal position than most Western governments during the period between about 2003 and maybe 2012. So they created a lot of runway for themselves to behave poorly. And that runway is being used as we speak.
We all miss you, Stephen Harper.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because on the one hand, I was listening to an interview where somebody pointed out that one of the really dramatic changes in U.S. politics is that conservatives have stopped caring about the long-term future of the U.S. government. Right. And one of the indicators is that conservatives have stopped talking about the deficit because they no longer care that the system is unsustainable. Right. They're no longer going to prop up the system that perpetuates the power of the left. And in a weird sort of way, by fixing the fiscal problems of the federal government, Chrétien, Martin, and Harper collectively enabled what has happened in Canada for the last 10 years.
It created the context wherein Justin Trudeau could run like ludicrous level deficits. He basically used up a good majority of that fiscal runway just to pursue his own ideological agenda and nothing else.
Nonsense, right? And the reason why the Canadian dollar, Justin Trudeau created a 50% run on the Canadian dollar over his term in office, but not an acute crisis. And the Carney government still has some time before there's an acute crisis in the Canadian dollar. Again, largely because of the efforts of what I would broadly call conservatives, both in the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party of Canada in the late 90s and early 2000s. It's an interesting dynamic because if you want to see the state apparatus turned over, fixing its fiscal problems is not it's counterproductive in a weird kind of way. So I don't know that if there was some prospect of electoral victory and I was advising a government coming in, I don't know that I would advise them to try to fix the financial problems of the Canadian government.
The system as system, if like you're saying, is the system as system is allowed to continue on by sound managers. So as long as you believe in the system, then by all means fix it. But if you're looking to destabilize the system, then financial mismanagement and creating people with hungry mouths and all these kind of things, the more social unrest you create due to bad economy, the more likely it is that you will have a real meaningful circulation of elites. And also not just on circulation of elites, but also a completely different approach to governance that, other than the current administrative state way of doing things.
Yeah, so it's an interesting problem. I don't yet have a formed opinion as to what's
the best thing to do.
We're very far away from power. There's no prospect that we're going to touch it in the immediate future. So fortunately, I don't really have to answer these questions. But if that were not the case, I'm not sure exactly what I would do about this particular problem. What I do know is that the Carney government is going to run straight into it here in about 2 years, but they're going to get their opportunity to, whatever it is they mean by making a generational investment, they're going to get an opportunity to do it, and we're going to see.
We're
going to see what comes of that.
But I thought as like a world-renowned video game poster that people were very, very deeply interested in what the Black Horse Reich would look like. I would assume you would have fleshed that out by now.
Well, for those who don't know, there is a 100 plus post Reddit thread speculating on the meaning of the phrase "the Black Horse Reich." So, if you're curious, you're not alone. So there you go. Anyways, is there anything else we should talk about the current state of Canada? The news over the last couple of weeks.
I think the biggest thing is to, and I know we've kind of touched on it a little bit here, a little bit there, is to really touch on, I think the overall state of the pivot and the ability of the Carney government to actually make changes in today's political context. I think this is one of the things that in the Canadian environment, that the really reality of both the political situation on the ground, the dynamics in the current leadership class, and then like the propaganda ground among the electoral, like, because you still have that legitimating mechanism that even though there are still, all of the forces say that the issues that must be faced with the pivot in terms of, the budgetary crisis, immigration, dealing with Canada's economic future, like this is sort of the range of things, having to grapple with various issues like the green energy mandate and its limits, that the Carney government, even though there are still position papers being put out by, credible academics saying that these issues have to be grappled with, and that the political realities that the liberal government in Canada, at least anyways, have created on the ground, and the leadership class in general have created, make it very, very difficult to actually do the pivot, and it undermines the incentives that they have to do them. We've been kind of watching the whole thing, kind of like, stuff needs to be done. They know it needs to be done, but they actually can't do it and continue to lead the country, which is just kind of bizarre spot to be in.
Well, I think it's interesting that they failed on the environmental side, right?
Yeah.
Almost exactly the agenda that I expected the Carney government to want to take on the immigration side, they've implemented. That this is exactly what I expected.
That's where you would expected them to bail on. But
on the environmental side, they've struggled to execute. They've done a few things. The carbon tax fundamentally doesn't exist anymore. They've got the ban on internal combustion engine sales that was scheduled for 2030 is no more. That's a big deal. But not building pipelines is a disaster. It is the most important economic issue in Canada by miles.
And refineries.
Pipelines, refineries, getting out of the situation where the United States is in total control of the economic prospects of the core engine of the Canadian export economy. That's a really big problem.
5 deep water ports built too.
Yeah, well, anyways, I talked about this a little bit in the video I just released about what it would take to make Canada a genuinely sovereign nation again. But it's interesting that they failed on that side. As you say, it appears they failed on that side because of the political struggle with the less competent parts of the left in the country. We'll see when they go to present a budget this fall, right? Like everything they did on the immigration side, they had the advantage that they could do just with executive action. They didn't need to pass any laws. Other parts of the pivot on the economy and on green, they actually need to pass laws, and that could be more challenging. We'll just kind of have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, because there's a whole process involved there, and then it really enters into into the realm of all of the political mechanisms of parliamentary democracy in Canada.
Yeah.
And you have to deal with committees and all the rest of it, right? It's not quite so simple that way. But yeah,
so we'll see how they come out on that. My guess is that they will get some, but not all of the pivot done on the economic side over the next couple of years, but that we're still going to run headlong into a currency crisis here before this is all over. So that's kind of where I think Canadian politics is going over the next couple of years, at least national politics, which makes the provincial tensions in Canada, both West and Quebec, profoundly relevant. Which brings me to the last topic that I wanted us to address on this show, which is what I would call the two impulses that pull at the Canadian online right. The first impulse is a kind of straight nationalist impulse that has the George Grant vision for the future of Canada. One nation, one culture, but one nation and one culture out of the peoples that existed in Canada pre maybe 1970, right? You see this vision promoted very aggressively by a wide variety of figures on the online right in Canada. Then you have what I would call the difficult reality on the ground, that there is not and never has been a single Canadian European identity. It just hasn't happened. Even when the nation has passed through tremendous traumatic struggles that would tend to be unifying moments, even when rates of intermarriage between groups were higher than they are today, still during the Second World War, during the First World War, during the Depression, European Canadians did not consider themselves a single nation at no point. Not in the 50s, not in the 40s, not in the 30s, not in the 20s, not in the 10s, right? To the extent where there was interethnic violence between not only French and English, but it's not well remembered, but in the 50s in Ontario, there was a lot of Irish need not apply going on in large parts of Ontario. And so the only thing in some sense that holds the European Canadian coalition that the online right or parts of the online right tend to tout together is the pressure of being categorized together by the progressive state. It's an interesting phenomenon because it means that if the online right ever actually has any real success, the coalition is going to come apart like sand in the hand, because the cohesion is the pressure. As soon as the pressure is released, the cohesion breaks. And all the little groups that don't have a common identity all come apart again and try to go their own way. And so when I look at the online right, and I look at visions for Canada's politics in some world after breaking free from the iron grip of the American empire, I really don't think that a compelling vision that's going to have currency has really emerged. I think you're just going to have the George Grant Lament for a Nation and moment all over again as the country transitions from servitude to this empire to servitude to whatever empire succeeds the American empire.
It has a long history, because the problem of identity in Canada is an interesting one, because the Canadians of British heritage, when the strength of the British Empire backed them, there was the real effort, and even a self-conscious effort, to de-emphasize one's Britishness, to emphasize one's Canadianness, in the hope that this would draw French Canadians into a similar posture of abandoning their Frenchness for a greater Canadianness. And that was a spectacular failure on two levels. One is that it never really undermined, or not so much undermined, but it never really blossomed into a French willingness to
French
abandon their Frenchness.
Yeah, they're always Quebecois. They're never Canadians.
Yeah, in many ways, as the propaganda grew for Canadian unity, the French Canadians within that felt a threat to them, and so it created almost an ethnogenic effect of strengthening their bonds with each other. And then while at the same time, then this reduced the strong British sense of identity that may have staved off things like, policies of mass immigration, or even so created a dominant culture within which people who immigrated to Canada were expected to conform, that you would be expected to behave like Britishmen, like, Brits and Englishmen. And so in many ways, the mistake was to try to create a unified Canadian culture rather than a negotiated settlement in a multicultural society or a multifactional society, and to bring the ethnic groups to the table as ethnic groups or regional groups, maybe at the same time,
Well, when Confederation was formed in 1867, it was imagined as a way to get self-governance for each of the ethnic groups within the new Dominion. Right.
Yeah.
You can read authors at the time talk about Confederation as a divorce between Upper and Lower Canada, with some other features tacked on. Now, obviously, there were some others who had different visions for it. John A. Macdonald certainly had different ideas about what Confederation would be than writers who spoke about it that way. But I think it's really important to be clear-eyed about what we're looking at here going forward. Canada has a core Anglo-Saxon population that represents something like 30-35% of the population. Another 10 or 15% of the population is of French extraction. Another 10 or 15% of the population are post-war European migrants who have their own identities, many of which are quite thick, but there's a complicated set of identity politics there. And then we have the new post-1980 Canadians who have their own set of factional ethnic interests. Those identities are all way stronger and much more strongly felt than the single civic national Canadian identity. Certainly, none of those groups would call themselves ethnically Canadian rather than ethnically Franco or ethnically British or ethnically whatever, right?
And so. Yeah, all these different groups. And then, so you have the ethnic groups, but then you also have the various like geographical regional interests that are separated around the regional economic production of the various areas, right? So you have the Alberta being the biggest, then Ontario, then Quebec, and then the Maritimes, and then BC's kind of whatever BC does, that BC logging industry and other resource extraction, right? It's got its own thing. And so in many ways, Canada needed to be like a regional negotiated settlement almost, but we have this overlay of this Laurentian consensus that tries to bind Canada together as a unified whole. Maybe you want to lay out sort of what the nature of that consensus is.
I actually want to I want to talk about it in passing, but I want to speak about it in the context of visions for the future. Sure. So the Laurentian consensus is a set of unstated resolved negotiations for how to deal with this ethnic and regional tension, right? So an element of the Laurentian consensus is that there's going to be Catholic schooling in every province in the country as separate religious schooling. Well, I don't get separate Reformed schooling. I have to pay for my separate Reformed schooling.
That's right.
Catholic, the government would pay for it. That's an unspoken element of this long-standing consensus in this country that has held it together. That consensus surrounding how to manage regional and ethnic tensions in the country is out of date, right? It needs to be updated. But the current Laurentian elite are incapable of renegotiating it honestly because of their progressive sensibilities. They refuse to acknowledge the differences between these groups of people, and so they can't reckon with them honestly as political factions. So it's making rearticulating a governing consensus for the country much more difficult.
And they have an investment in that kind of, what the Americans call it the global post-war consensus, but we have the post-reinvention consensus of like what Canada is, and it's enforced propagandistically across the whole country. And the real thing is, if you let go of that propaganda, does their political coalition fall apart? And so they're deeply invested in it.
Well, it's a very delicate operation to re-engineer that consensus, and they're not up to the task to do it, which is part of why the regional and ethnic tensions in the country just get worse and worse every year. So that's that piece of it. But I want to address the online right here for a minute. Any future country that exists on this territory is going to be a similar compromise between ethnic, religious, and regional groups in the country. And it's going to be a politically negotiated compromise under the mutual threat that the territory is going to be dominated by outside interests if we don't cooperate. Right. That's the only future for Canada. And so when you talk about Canadian nationalism, it has to be understood in that context. It can't, first of all, populism as a strategy is going to collapse in that environment, because the groups that you might try to unite in order to drive a populist rebellion are too dissimilar from one another to ever cooperate or to ever congeal around like a propagandistic narrative.
Like, think about it in terms of the Canadian context. You talk about, okay, whites have to unite against the immigrant hordes, which is it's a dumb narrative, because there is no world today in which a French Canadian is going to unite with an Albertan on anything.
Yeah.
Like it is. So you have to grapple with that reality. There is no such thing as like a white consensus in Canada. It just doesn't exist. So you have to deal with that.
And your messaging, there's no message that's going to hit both of those groups comparably. It just,
and unite them in a single vision.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. And so the populist right playbook that has been run in Europe under somebody like Viktor Orban, or that Trump has run to some extent in the US in order to obtain some political power, there's no political power at a national level on the other end of that strategy. It's just impossible. And so the political strategies that have to emerge for the right have to be fundamentally different than that in Canada. They have to, populism works within groups. It doesn't work across groups. So there has to be the groups who are going to cooperate to forge a future of Canada have to have their own distinct elite and have to have a vision on which they can cooperate.
Well, they have to have we have to be able to acknowledge the fact that they have their own interests and that they have their own power, and that has to be respected.
And they have to have actual political negotiations between them about how to share power in a political entity designed to keep out alternative power structures like the Americans or like some other or to prevent the country from frankly being colonized.
But they also have to recognize, even though they're different, that they do on some levels have a shared mutual interest. And I think it's in your intros, I think it's George Grant who has a quote, we didn't know what we wanted to be, but we certainly knew that we didn't want to be American. Now that is not, that's only partially accurate from a historical perspective, but there is truth there. So there is a sense that there's a real deep-seated thing is that as much as Canada is a satellite state of America, there is still a deep-seated thing of like, we don't want to be Americans. But if you translate it, we also don't want to be Chinese. We also don't want to be a client state of India. And we don't want to be a client state of Russia. Canada, in a sense, all of these different groups do have, in a sense, a shared sense of like, okay, we're different, but we don't want, I mean, deep down, we really don't want to be part of these other entities. We want to be our own thing. And so now we've got to come to the table and work out a way that we can live with each other that we can support each other in not being American, not being Chinese, not being Indian, not being European, whatever it is. But we can be ourselves within this context and we can negotiate a settlement together. And I think that's a very doable thing.
Yeah, the incentive to cooperate is to allow all those regional identities to continue to exist, right?
Yes, exactly. Because we're stronger together, battling off Americans, Chinese, whatever, than we are apart.
Yes. So I think it's important to kind of understand what is politically possible in Canada's future. And I think there's a lot of people operating outside of Canada's existing political culture, who are struggling against that reality, and it's time to kind of put it on the table and then see where we can go from there. Well, anyways, thank you, Krῠptός. It's been I've really enjoyed having you back on. Is there anything you're doing in the next couple of weeks that you want to make sure people pay attention to?
Well, I'm probably still going to continue to do this sort of weird, eclectic bunch. I have a piece coming out in IM 1776, or Mark Granza's publication. And then I've got some conversations that I have been setting up. Like I actually have one with Ron Dodson where we're going to talk about how managerialism is actually, well, Pharisee, but the Jewish takeover of
oh my goodness.
You know how Ron always, I know people don't know, Ron Dodson's a wonderful friend of both of us, and he always keeps saying that he's going to get himself in trouble by saying things, but he never really does. This one is going to be the exercise where we actually make that happen. Maybe.
All right. Well, there you go.
Oh, there we go. So that happens tomorrow, actually. I record. We'll see.
Okay. Well, I mean, we'll continue to plug on at this channel. I don't expect that. Well, the budget will drop this fall. We'll have to have a look at that, but I don't expect there to be a lot of real political news in Canada over the next 6 months. So I'm going to try to continue to plug away at historical and cultural topics to try to deepen the right's understanding of Canada as it has been, as it could be in the future, and to try to imagine.
Well, here's one way that people and like the audience can think about it, and just to kind of break frame a little bit. But given the whole tariff thing, everybody was weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, like, why are the intertrade barriers like higher than they are with the trade barriers to the U.S.? And if Canada is going to come up with a negotiated settlement, interprovincial or interregional trade barriers may actually be a good thing, actually, and may actually help keep Canada together as a unified whole. So that's something to think about.
Yeah, it's a complicated thing. Tariff policy is many things, but it's not simple. So we'll just have to kind of see how it goes. Anyways, thank you so much, and thank you to the audience. We'll be back again soon.
Canada originally was put together by two groups of people who didn't have much in common but didn't want to be American.
The line just popped into my head. A bunch of the boys was a-whooping it up. And there I got my start.
We have had a flag. Flags can be changed. But flags cannot be imposed, the sacred symbols of a people's hopes and aspirations, by the simple, capricious, personal choice of a Prime Minister of Canada.
I have watched this country for half of my life from abroad, and we have turned complacency into just that, a national sport.
I am resolutely opposed to all innovation, all change, but I am determined to understand what's happening. I don't choose just to sit and let the juggernaut roll over me.